sa inyo, magandang gabi. Depende kung anong oras nyo pinapanood. Nandito na naman po tayo sa Proyekto Pilipino. Medyo understaffed po kami ngayon. Ako si Leloy Claudio at kasama ko as always si Claudio Santiago. Pero wala po ngayon si Father Tito at saka si Manolo. So pagpasensya nyo na, dalawa lang po kami ngayon. Pero sana we can make up for it sa aming energy, di ba Carlo? Kailangan naman talaga ng energy para sa topic natin ngayon sa Proyekto Pilipino. Since yung topic natin is yung bagong mapa na nilabas ng China at yung implications ito para dun sa dispute natin over certain parts of the South China Sea or tinatawag nating in our nationalist media, yung West Philippine Sea. And I'm very glad na meron tayong expert na makakausap ngayon, isang legal expert. Siya ang Dean ng Institute of Law ng University of Asia and the Pacific. According to his bio, he's a lawyer specializing in international law, constitutional law, and the philosophy of law. As I mentioned, he's the Dean of the Institute of Law as well as the Vice Chairman of the Operations Committee of the School of Social Sciences, Law and Governance. Mababasa niyo po siya as a columnist sa Business World, and he is also counsel sa Policarpio and Accorda Law Office. Our guest is si Dean Jeremy Gatdula. Welcome po, Dean, sa Proyekto Pilipino. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Leloy, for inviting me. And also, good morning, Carlo.
Morning.
So Jeremy, let's begin with the big question, no? Itong map na kalalabas lang. What is it about this map na nilabas ng China at bakit ang daming siguro nainis dito sa mapa na to at anong implications ito para sa mga Pilipino?
Naglabas sila ng map at all, and particularly at this time. The official talking point in China is that there's nothing new naman daw about the map, which is, as usual, a lie as far as they're concerned. They have made additions to certain claims to sa map, not necessarily as far as the Philippines is concerned, although we'll have to examine on that one. Definitely as against India, nagdagdag sila ng territories, Japan, and surprisingly even as far as involving Russia. I think I may have misstated when I said that there's no addition as far as the Philippines is concerned. They have made more aggressive claims in relation to the map. Yung talking point or narrative sa media is instead of a 9-dash line, ngayon naging 10-dash line na siya or something. And but more tellingly is the fact that it's coming out after so much international pressure has resulted from the ruling ng arbitral tribunal, and the fact that they just water can some of our ships when we were trying to support them, yung Sierra Madre, we were essentially trying to provide resources for them, and they have been harassing our fishermen. I think over the weekend there has been news that they have set up certain obstacles that will make it difficult para sa ating mga mangingisda na gawin yung kanilang trabaho sa area na yon. So yung context ng mapa is really as far as the Philippines is concerned, is really the more significant one. Kumbaga sa lengguwahe ngayon, nagda-double down in China. Instead of being more cooperative sa international law, sa international community, they're becoming still more aggressive in relation to their territorial claims.
But back to the basics po tayo, nabanggit nyo po na yung 9-dash line naging 10-dash line na ngayon. Ano nga, can you remind our viewers nga po, ano po yung 9-dash line and why is it controversial and why is it even more controversial na naging 10-dash line na ngayon?
Well, actually, legally, there's really no significance to what, I mean, even the international tribunals, I think, pointed out the fact that there's really nothing to sa 9-dash line. It's really more like a marketing thing or advertising for them to be able to crystallize yung tinatawag ng territorial claims nila. So 9-dash line, 10-dash line doesn't really make a difference in legal terms, but although I have to clarify that a little, but in how should I put it? In political terms, in trying to gain something in the mindset of people, it may have some sort of impact. We'll see. The fact that we're even discussing a 9-dash line, 10-dash line tells us that yung discussion natin is nag-move to the framework that the Chinese want, which is completely over a fictional thing. But there's a strange thing kasi about international law na medyo different from Domestic law kasi is essentially coming from, for example, sa atin, kung ano yung ginawa ng Kongreso. International law, medyo different eh. Siguro the closest that I could say about international law is that it operates almost in the same way that the Catholic Church. So kung consistent yung message, for example, hindi inoppose, for example, in Philippines, it is possible na mag-solidify yung something that's fictional and useless. If they keep saying it and saying it, it may result into something that could later on, 2 years, solidify into something more binding. Out a statement in an official press release na they are claiming this particular area, tapos protesta, and later on nagkahablahan, pwede kasi nilang sabihin na, so it means that you acquiesced or you agreed to this particular position. So, and that's why tama yung ginagawa rin ng DFA, na yung mga maliliit na bagay, like maps, na, sa totoo lang, officially, wala tayong pakialam sa map. I mean, kung gumawa sila maglabas ng map, doesn't really affect us kasi ang importante for us is kung ano nakasunod sa constitution natin tsaka sa batas natin eh. Pero at the international level, it's also very good na we protest whatever actions they are so that we can essentially lay down a trail of evidence to show that they're doing is essentially legal and that we agree to it.
Leloy, gusto kong palawakin yung konteksto ng pinag-uusapan natin, no? Kasi Dean Jeremy, essentially itong Proyekto Pilipino, it's a civic show. And one of the things we like to discuss in our show in the civics is yung konsepto ng sovereignty. In which case it seems sa territorial disputes pumapasok ko yung issue ng sovereignty. Can you explain, sir, ano ba ang sovereignty? Anong ibig sabihin nito para sa ating proyekto, para sa Pilipinas?
So sovereignty, I mean, siguro let's just put it in the simplest terms that we can. It's essentially the monopoly of power. That's it. I mean, it's the ability to be able to exercise yung violence within that particular territory. Of course, there will be legal definitions of sovereignty that are around the supreme and uncontrollable power inherent in a state by which the state is governed and so on. But bottom line is the ability to be able to exercise that monopoly of power within that territory. Now, within certain areas, habang paiba yung teritoryo, nagbabago ng konti yung nature ng sovereignty that we have. That is why sometimes you would hear some international lawyers say that we don't have sovereignty over this area, but rather sovereign rights and so on. Essentially, ang ibig sabihin lang nun is that whereas on this particular area, ang nangingibabaw talaga yung gobyerno ng Pilipinas, pagdating sa certain areas, nangingibabaw yung gobyerno ng Pilipinas on certain top lang. So that's what it means. So pagdating, for example, sa territorial sea natin, which is 12 nautical miles from the low water mark, which is the low tide area, anything that is within that, kumbaga, nasa control ng Philippines. A crime happens, may contract na sign, may labor employment that happens, usually ang Philippine government. And so you can file a case in court and all of that. Outside 12 nautical mile mark, which is the territorial sea, yung susunod doon will be the contiguous zone. Now, the contiguous zone, that the government still has authority, pero on only 4 areas usually. Yung tinatawag na FISC. The fiscal, immigration, sanitary, and customs areas. Outside of that, wala na tayong control, essentially. But although we have to remember that within the low water mark, the low tide, and then count 200 nautical miles is the exclusive economic zone. And so within that is yung ability ng government natin to be able to exploit whatever is found in that area. So that covers, so lima, as far as the contiguous zone is concerned. Fiscal, immigration, sanitary, customs, and then yung economic resources that are found within. After the 24th nautical mile, then that would be essentially exploitation of resource. Now, sometimes the reason why it becomes confusing is because what if, for example, a crime happens or may nagka-travel na boat, and then sometimes the media would say, or even official documents would say that high seas siya. Yes, actually, that's high seas because of the fact that if it does not involve, for example, yung economic matters, then essentially that's parang more or less free for all. As long as hindi madadamage yung economic rights of Philippines, that would be essentially it. The same thing with the contiguous zone. As long as hindi madadamage yung 4 things I mentioned earlier and resources, and also add na rin the possibility na baka makagawin sila sa contiguous zone that may affect na mag-filter through our sea. As long as that does not happen, then in all essence, we consider that also as high seas. So technically, our territory really ends on the 12th mile but we have certain authority pa on certain limited areas outside that 12 mile. Now, as long as none of those activities nga violate those certain areas or filter or trickle in to our territory, like for example, nag-dump sila ng toxic waste outside the territorial sea, pero na-harm yung environment, yung economic resource, fish, the corals and what have you. Obviously, we have jurisdiction there, and we can if we need to, we either sanctions or whatever penalty that we can impose. So I don't know if I addressed your question.
Actually, so pwede na natin ngayon tayin yung tanong ko at yung tanong ni Carlo. So based on that definition of what is ours, bakit po ngayon nagiging fiction yung 9-dash line or itong possible 10-dash line? What renders that fictional?
It's like tayo magkapit-bahay, and then malinaw naman talaga na ito yung ito yung, let's say may house, and then there's may puno. Tapos yung puno na yon, for example, in between our two lands, ang may-ari ikaw, Leloy. Tapos all of a sudden gumawa ako ng mapa, pinost ko doon sa namin na ang pag-aari ko is all the way up to your gate, all the way up to your back door. I mean, kahit ba gumawa ako ng map, does not make the map true. It's still fictional.
Hanggang saan po ba daw yung 9-dash line na yun? Until
Actually,
what point does it reach?
So imagine so this may be a little bit imagine this is the Luzon. So the China is here, right? If tama yung basa ko sa screen, China would be here. Their 9-dash line is almost
so in other words sir, hindi lang fiction, garapal talaga na fiction yung ginagawa nila kung ganun na.
Yeah, actually, yeah. It's part of their parang yung tinatawag na lawfare attack nila. At the same time, yung wolf diplomacy that they've been trying to do na medyo aggressive sila sa world stage. But at the same time, they're also trying to in a way tire us out na kaka-repeat. Hopefully baka mamaya mapagod, and then but also the context of the fact that they've been setting up mga facilities in some of the areas there. Naglalagay they would get a rock, for example, or an island, and then they would pour concrete, they would set up runways, they would set up military installations and so on. And essentially that's really the point ng ating case against them sa Hague. So out with a map, nga siya for its, how should I put it, idiocy. The context nga lang is that it's within the context of them doing all these other militarily nefarious activities that, and if you subscribe to the notion that international diplomacy and relations is essentially a thing that works in decades, the probability that it may come to a point that they will have a friendly government, for example, here in the Philippines, that will essentially say, well, nandiyan na yung military installations there. So what are we going to do about it? It's always there. The point for us is to be able to keep up the pressure. You mentioned energy kanina, so it's essentially the same thing. They're keeping up a certain amount of energy in relation to their claim, then we have to match it. They may be a big country, pero pagdating naman siguro sa utak at saka sa pagiging vigorous in defense of our territories, we can match that. And we have internal law to back up, which they don't. So the only thing lang naman talaga that they are in a way parang threatening everybody is that if they're not happy with how it goes, then they might do something stupid. And that is why it's important then that we have friends who are willing to do what China is willing to do if in case it does something stupid.
Din, nabanggit nyo nga ho, parang away kapitbahay to, no? Pero I think it must be told na China is not the only nation we have territorial disputes with regarding to that area. As far as I know, we have territorial disputes with Indonesia, Vietnam, and so forth. But ano ho yung kakaiba?
Malaysia, Carlo, of course.
Malaysia din, of course. Oo.
Yeah.
So ano ho yung kakaiba dun sa territorial disputes natin sa itong mga bansa na to at yung medyo mas controversial na disputes natin with China?
No, it's
Bukod
really
dun sa go ahead.
It's really the level of aggression. it's really the level of aggression in terms of sa law that they're trying to project, sa politics that they're trying to project, and the extent of the territory that they're trying to claim. Yung other countries kasi, okay, they might make claims, they might encroach on certain areas ang EEZ natin. Pero ito kasi halos sa ano na, in my analogy earlier, it's kumbaga kung may backdoor si Leloy sa kitchen niya, yung mapa ko naka-draw na, kumbaga paglabas siya ng kusina, yun na yun eh. Nandun na yung map ko eh. And that's what they're essentially, in fact, in some of their calculations, minsan pa nga lumalagpas nga pa nga dun sa backdoor eh. Sometimes they would even go to the extent of claiming certain portions of the house pa. If I continue with my analogy. And the fact that China, of course, is an incredibly big country. It's an aspiring superpower. To be honest, to be frank about it, kumbaga, Malaysia, perhaps we take on. Indonesia, perhaps we can take on. What's scary kasi nga about China is its absolute superiority in terms of yung quantity niya of military and so on. But and that's what makes it significant. And the fact that it is very much willing to use international simply as something parang disposable for it. We know that China has a record of bullying other countries, even areas that is under its control, Nepal, and other ethnicities that are within its. We know that it has no compunction in locking up its citizens. When we look at, for example, the extent of their lockdowns, and if you experience that as a Tiananmen Square that we saw with them, and so it's a huge number of things. It's the value of human rights.
Yes.
It's the way we look at certain the way we look at government. We may have a certain amount of similarity to what Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam. China is really just a different animal, as particularly as far as this issue is concerned. Although it's easy also to talk about China kasi as if it were one big homogeneous group. I mean, China is of course one huge country, and within that country, medyo iba-iba rin yung ugali ng mga tao. I mean, possible, for example, with Shanghai down sa south, they're not exactly in agreement with the people naman sa north. And mostly it's the people in the north, perhaps, if we can make generalizations, in Beijing and so on, that are actually the ones causing trouble, whereas the rest of the country essentially wants to survive lang and get on with their lives. So, but taking that into taking all the other things into consideration, the reason why China precisely is different is for all those I mentioned earlier.
I think importante po yung nabanggit nyo na iba-iba in China, and I also want to refer yung audience natin sa isang previous episode namin about Chinoys, about how hindi nyo pwedeng i-implicate lahat ng Chinese dun sa ginagawa ng estado nila, lalo na yung mga tao na hindi naman citizen of China, kundi mga Pilipino who are of Chinese descent, who are Filipino citizens first before anything, and who are very loyal to this country. So I just want to refer people back to that episode. And I really didn't appreciate po yung nabanggit nyo about yung nature ng Chinese state. Hindi po ito demokrasya kagaya natin at kagaya ng mga kapitbahay natin. Isa po itong one-party authoritarian state. And yung differences in values na yon, nakikita natin din dun sa mga alyansa natin. I think one of the reasons why mas komportable tayo bilang mga Pilipino na maging closer to the United States, lalo na dito sa issue na to ng China, ay dahil bagaman they committed violence against us when they colonized us, matagal na yun, at hindi at demokrasya sila as opposed to China. At bagaman colony tayo ng US dati, sinakop tayo ng US dati, hindi na tayo sinasakop ng US ngayon. In fact, ang sumasakop sa atin ngayon ay yung China, di ba? Ano po yung pagtingin nyo dito dun sa yung sa difference, I guess, between yung history natin with the US, na violent, you can't deny it's violent, at saka yung present day tensions natin with China and how we negotiate that as a country?
Well, first of all, I'd like say I completely agree with sa sinabi mo kanina na and it's good you brought it up. Kasi we refer to China, and then there are of course Filipino Chinese here in the Philippines. Obviously, we're not referring to that. and they're some of our biggest, obviously most nationalistic, most patriotic citizens that we have.
Opo.
And they've done a lot of good for our society economy. Having said so, a bit disappointing that there are some sectors of our society that have been serving as how should I put it, mouthpieces for the and which I think is incredibly counterproductive. It's for whatever reasons that they may be doing this. The bottom line is that it goes against our national security, and I think that this is something that is seriously that should be seriously looked into. Good point that you raised, because this is again one of those things that those mouthpieces have been pointing out na bakit daw galit na galit tayo sa China, and then samantalang daw in-invade tayo ng US, Japan, Spain, even the UK got into the usapan.
Yes.
But as you rightly pointed out, this is in the past. I mean, what we're dealing right now, if any of those countries would be doing the same thing that China is doing, then
Papalagay
obviously our
tayo.
reaction should be exactly, it should be the same. And the only reason why lang naman, for example, I mean, and let's not put it, I mean, China has also been, to a certain extent, been causing problems for us because of the fact that they have a lot of piracy activities nung panahon pa ng Kastila. And China has actually been united lang naman in relatively in a recent amount of time lang. So we can't exactly say that China as a state that we know of now has been particularly peaceful as far as the Philippines is concerned, when they themselves have been actually coming here, again, to certain siguro factions or sections nila, and has also been bothering the Philippines. I remember a particular time, I think, when some of their pirates invaded, for example, Manila, and si Limahong had to essentially create nga cannons, if that story is true. I mean, you guys are the historians, in order to respond nga to those Chinese piracy. Bottom line is, it's not because it's China, it's because of the fact that we are defending what is ours. That's it. It doesn't matter kung sino yung bansa na yon, but it's ours. And the narrative na sinabi I mean, whatever you may think of President Marcos, I mean, he is our president right now, and what he said is true. This is not merely us being used as a pawn between great powers like the US and China or what have you. But okay, let's say that may be true, but bottom line, this is also us protecting what is ours. This is essentially our soil. And if people are going to say, are you really going to die for a certain island that you haven't even visited for? Well, the question is that you're not really doing it lang for yourself. You're doing it for your father, grandfathers natin, who have essentially decided that they will defend us vis-a-vis all those other invaders before, and you're doing it naman for your kids and your grandchildren and so on, because what those islands represent is not merely a place na pwede ka mag-beach or pwede ka mag-fishing. It represents essentially the place where we live yung way of life natin. It's our house. Kumbaga, it's when you look at your house, you're not looking merely at a full structured building. You're looking at your home, where you live your life, and that essentially is what our territory is. So what we are defending is maybe some pebbles lang or some ocean or waters. What we are defending is our values, our way of life, our history, our culture, and ultimately our families.
I think that's beautiful. That's really that's really stirring. Carlo, I'm curious, as somebody na nagtrabaho din sa DFA, kung sa tingin mo yung nabanggit ni Dean Jeremy, ganun din siguro yung feeling ng marami sa mga former colleagues mo sa DFA, no? Na kahit ano lang to, kahit a couple of islands lang to, it's what it means, it's what it represents. And syempre may material detriment din, kasi yung mga fishermen natin na kumakain na napipilitang kumain ng galunggong dahil hindi na sila pwede mag-fish kung saan dapat sila mag-fish, diba? And yung damage sa ating ecosystems, but yung material damage na yun, then yung symbolic damage na yun. So I think your former colleagues are very passionate about this also, no? Would I be correct in saying that, Carlo?
Yes. Actually, kaya we actually, Dean, we tried to get some of my former colleagues to guest alongside with you, but since medyo mainit ang usapan, they opted not to. Kasi it might be misconstrued as an official statement on their part. But
So, basahin mo na lang kung ano iniisip nila, Carlo.
but definitely very very I think they air the same sentiments as Dean, no? Kasi kanina binanggit ko yung yung konsepto ng sovereignty, inexplain natin yung sovereignty, and the two factors there that we have to keep in mind always is people and territory. Yung dalawa yon, at ito lagi ang pinaglalaban ng ating mga diplomats abroad, no? Meaning yung tao, kahit sino man niya, kahit saang mang lugar yang na yung isang Pilipino na nakatira, bibigyan natin ng protection yan, regardless of where they are and what they do. And the second is yung territory natin, yung pinag-usapan nga ni Dean, whether it's we're talking about the mainland or Benham Rise or on the other side sa West Philippine Sea. Ang ganda ng sinabi ni Dean kasi paliitin natin yung yung scope nung pinag-usapan natin. Balik natin sa bahay. Kuwari meron tayong isang parte ng ating lote na doon sa dulo na madumi, matalahib, hindi natin masyadong pinupuntahan. Pero yung kapitbahay natin, bigla na lang naglagay ng upuan isang beses. Tapos hindi natin pinansin. Kinabukasan, naglagay ng mesa. Hindi natin pinansin. Tapos isang linggo na lumipas, may kubo na. So yung ating vigilance sa ating kung ano yung sa atin, napaka-importante. And second, yung respeto
But
sa
if I
ating
may,
sarili.
but
Go ahead.
but if I may, with regard to your analogy, I mean, and I hope you don't mind, kasi the analogy is that okay, fine, they're using certain areas of our territory, tapos mas pinaganda pa nga nila in a manner na hindi natin mapaganda, and your analogy, I don't know, so nagkaroon ng kubo, so nagamit yung area, tapos tayo naman kasi okay, but actually baka medyo ano pa nga ng konti, even if it's not right, medyo mapapaisip ko pa ng konti, baka do we really have to kill people for that or something? But that's not what's happening eh. What's happening is that nagay sila ng kubo para maglagay ng mga baril doon, tapos babantayan tayo so that pag habang hindi tayo natutulog at nakasolidify na yung kubo, they could sneak in naman and get our house. That's essentially what they're doing it's not that they're merely putting areas there para i-exploit yung resources. They're putting those areas that they're building strategically so that when it comes to the time na siguro kailangan nilang gawin, mas madali for them to be able to come in and invade us. That's why they're not putting museums eh. They're not putting I don't know, mga cultural centers in those islands that they're developing. They're putting airports, military installations, and all of that. So and that has essentially one thing lang in mind, and that is if ever, for example, there's an invasion, then that's it. The other thing that we also have to consider is that we are a country, and we see this a bigas eh. I mean, whatever happens, we need international trade to survive. I mean, people may have suspicions on international trade, but we need trade to survive. I mean, other countries, like, for example, the US perhaps could close themselves off like what Japan did in the past, and they could completely survive on their own. But we are one of those countries that need to be able to trade with other countries to be able to feed our citizens and run our businesses and so on. And most of our trade is going in those oceans. And a lot of the other countries' trade is also going into those oceans. India's trade, 55% of that would be going in that area. Malaysia, US, Britain, and all of that. So what China is essentially doing is that by putting all those installations there, is gusto niyang palabasin na siya yung police sa area na yun eh.
Din, actually, yan yung isa pang gusto kong yung tanongin, yung freedom of navigation. Can you explain what freedom of navigation is? And you started on it already, and how this will impact us kung China will be the sole policeman of the area?
Well, the thing, the main difference is that obviously the policeman in the area right now that we have is the US. And I think the US has made a certain deal with people in the sense that we will trade with you, but if you notice, you could see it in the way our trading numbers are going. some people will say that our biggest trading partner is China, and then Japan, then US, Japan are on the lower ranking. And that may be true. But then you examine yung numbers. Our trade with China may be huge, but a huge part of that is essentially importation coming from China, not export. So kumbaga we are in a trade deficit with China. If it were a negosyo, tayong dalawa, Carlo, mas bumibili pa ako sa iyo kaysa bumibili ka sa akin. So sino sa ating dalawa kumikita ng pera ngayon? If I'm the one buying from you more than you're buying from me. That may be simplistic, but now in relation to the US, there's a different deal that's going on, and this has been happening since World War II or after World War II. And that is, they decided that, okay, we will trade, and essentially we will allow ourselves to trade at a deficit. Kumbaga, kaya if you look at our numbers with the US, we have a trade surplus with the US. We are exporting more than we are buying from the Americans. Pero obviously the Americans, like any country, and this is something then I wish our countrymen would really understand, no country will do something na hindi siya makikinabang. And it will always be yung self-interest niya iniisip niya. And so what is the interest here of the US? The interest here of the US is that, sige, buy from you more than I buy from you, than you buy from me, pero I will be allowed access to police everybody here. Now, what's the difference now between China and the US doing that? Well, at least the US, kilala natin yung way of life nila. We know their political values, we know their political system, and so on. Is it possible that when the Chinese takes over, they will probably do the same? We don't know. In fact, we don't even know how their government runs. We know that the US has a tripartite system and so on, but we don't know we do know that there's a Chinese Congress and but we don't even know how that operates and the like. So is it good ba na in an ideal world na walang one power trying to police everybody else? Yes, of course, but that's not the world we live in right now. And I'm sure people will disagree, pero at least kung meron man, if I may use these terms, I'm borrowing from Franklin Roosevelt. They may be a bastard, but at least these guys are our bastards. Yeah. And so and for me, that's the calculation that what the Philippines is going to be making. If I may shift to something that Leloy said with regard to that it's a one-party rule and that it's an autocratic system. Interestingly enough, it's no longer a one-party rule. It's a one-person rule. Mm-hmm. Because for the past couple of years and for the past several months, what Xi Jinping has been doing is to systematically eliminate any possible opposition and future opposition. So what we have in front of us right now is a huge country being run simply by one person, and one person alone. Now, kaya for people who are saying na mas maganda pa siguro yung benevolent dictatorship, I think you guys heard of that term in the past, na baka mamaya masyadong messy and democracy na Philippines and so on. Perhaps we need someone na more firm ang kamay. Well, you have China now to look at, because if China fails or succeeds, and right now I don't think it's succeeding, you can now attribute it purely to that non-democratic form of government, because it's simply being made. The decision is being made by one person, and China, by all economic numbers, whether it's inflation, consumer spending, loans, their currency, pati yung demographics nila are all down, which of course makes it scary, because if you have a country now becoming that economically unstable, you may not know what it does in order for it to be able to, number one, generate unity among its citizens, and number two, because of the fact that it might require economic assistance, and they might get that assistance through non-voluntary means from other countries. So
maybe not inflation, mas masama pa rin ata historically in the last year or two ang inflation sa atin at saka sa US, pero everything else, and especially yung real estate crisis po ng China ngayon na talagang malala dahil mukhang magkakaroon sila ng real estate bubble doon sa China dahil
unemployment, it's terrible.
Mataas yung unemployment, and then of course yung dahil nag one child policy sila, lumiliit yung labor force nila, and then dahil sobrang grabe ng COVID restrictions, mumagal talaga yung ekonomiya, And of course, kung sa US yan, pwede mo, kung ayaw mo yung nangyayari, pwede mo palitan yung gobyerno kasi bumuboto ka eh. Sa China, hindi. Sabi nyo nga, sir, hindi lang one party rule, one man rule. President for life, Xi Jinping. And that's I think the kind of democratic threat. Babalik ako doon sa tema ng Proyekto Pilipino. Ang Proyekto Pilipino is a democratic project and nag-aaral tayo ng civics para i-embolden yung sarili natin bilang mga mamamayan na magsalita ukol sa mga issue na may halaga at may importansya para sa mga kapwa natin Pilipino. Walang ganong klase. Hindi yun, walang proyekto China ngayon. Dahil lang meron ngayon ay proyekto Xi Jinping. At taliwas yun sa mga prinsipyo natin bilang isang bansa. Taliwas yun sa civics principles natin. Balik ako dun sa solutions naman natin ngayon dito sa tensions natin. Yung arbitration po, so nag-file po tayo sa The Hague. Balik tanaw lang po tayo. Ano po yung kaso natin doon? Ano yung sinabi natin at ano yung ruling ng The Hague nung magsampa tayo?
Well, we would have wanted sana na i-outright declare ng arbitral tribunal na tayo may-ari noon lahat. Pero that's not realistic. Bottom line, what the Hague arbitral tribunal said is that yung mga areas na alam natin na ang may-ari is yung Philippines, and we will, speaking as the Hague tribunal ako, I'm not going to comment on kung tama ba yung claim mo o hindi. We'll just say na lang on the assumption that these are owned by the Philippines. What are essentially are they? And so they made a distinction. The most important one is that they made a distinction between low tide elevation, rocks, and then islands. And so pag sinabing low tide elevation, wala siyang territorial sea kahit anuman. Rock, may territorial sea. Island, it has a territorial sea contiguous zone, EEZ. Most of the things na nakuha ng China na are being contested are either LTE or rock. Tayo naman, na alam natin sa atin, and malakas yung claim natin na sa atin, have all been either confirmed as rocks or islands. So, in terms of yung sea area, more or less ako confirm na yung kung nasa constitution natin, itong laking vast area of sea, counting the EEZ, is essentially ours. And the area na kiniklaim yung China, and doesn't matter kasi masasapawan natin either because it's part of our territorial sea or it will form part of our EEZ. Kasi nga either rock lang sila or LTE. So that's one. And it's very significant because of the fact that kumbaga more or less na-establish yung oceans natin. The second really important thing na sinabi ng Hague Tribunal is that yung immutability nung areas. Meaning that if it's an LTE, kahit anong gawin mong buhos ng konkreto dyan, hindi siya mako-convert into a rock, which will lead it to having a territorial sea. Or a rock, kahit anong gawin mong buhos tapos gawin mo ng airport, lagay mo ng hotel or what have you, it will not be converted into an island in legal terms, thus giving it a territorial sea, CZ and EEZ. So what does it allow us? Number one, it establishes our marine areas, our ocean areas. But number two, it also serves as an encouragement for us na kahit anong gawing military installations, well, it will not gain any credence sa international law. We'll just have to keep on the pressure up of making diplomatic protests, hopefully get more support sa UN. And in the meantime, and this is very important, and this is maybe the part na medyo I will be disliked by your audience. In the meantime, we really need to build up our military. And that includes, if ever, building up a civilian force. I mean, when you look at the other countries in the area, whether it be Singapore, Korea, Vietnam, and the others, they all have a certain stint ng military for their youths, 20 years old, 25, 30. And it's a really necessary point there. When you look at our military right now, and then you look at our youth, let's say, when you look at our 20 to 35 years old, we have around 70% of the population is between 20 to 35. That's 70%. 70% of 110 is, let's say, 80 million. You get 10% of that as your military, as your standing force. That's already 8 million. And let's not say that pipe dream yung ability ng Philippines to fight against China, because Israel has been doing it for years in the Middle East, and they're an incredibly smaller country, small country compared to their neighbors. And our military has been highly experienced in fighting conflict. Their military has not fought in any armed conflict in decades na. I mean, so in terms of battle hardened experience, our military is but that also entails then us getting military support and security alliances with all other countries. So that I think is quite important for us, particularly those that are like-minded in terms of our values and democratic way of thinking. But also another thing that I kept saying, and I've been pointing this out in my column, but the other is simply enforce Philippine law. We have a bunch of laws here in the Philippines in relation to immigration, in relation to taxation, in relation to businesses that could be formed, that we just simply need to apply. And if everyone has to be patriotic, then that's essentially what you do. You apply the laws that you have here in the Philippines. We are projecting kasi democratic values abroad and rule of law, pero pagdating mo naman sa sarili mong bansa, you're not applying the rule of law here in the Philippines, and that becomes a little bit hypocritical. So if we have, for example, an illegal alien problem, we have problems with regard to gambling, we have problems in relation to non-payment of taxes and so on, particularly, for example, the Sapogo and all of that. That's essentially all within government control, and that essentially just means lang being able to apply when you need to. So for me, those would be the first steps in a very long struggle ahead of us. So.
Leloy, there's also, I mean, the more prominent solutions of course we're aware of is yung panalo natin sa tribunal. But I would like to say yung frontliners natin dito, definitely yung Coast Guard, and also
Yes.
the men and women of the foreign service.
More power po sa inyo.
Like you're talking about solutions. Earlier, at least in my time when I was still there, we on the diplomatic front, we tended to favor a multilateral approach as opposed to a bilateral approach. Multilateral meaning gusto nating ilatag yung issues na to in a bigger group, meaning whether it's through ASEAN, yung regional organization natin dito, or whether it's with Vietnam, China. Yun ang difference natin with China, meaning China kasi gusto nilang bilateral yung usap, na tayong dalawa lang mag-uusap, wala nang iba makikialam. Tayo naman, gusto natin, ilatag natin sa lahat. Wala tayong tinatago.
Yeah, and there's a practical reason also for that. Because in my case, for example, I've helped out the government for international trade, and it's always been the same. The powerful countries would like it on a bilateral negotiations, and it's really a practical reason. I mean, if you're from DFA, how many people can you send as part of your negotiating team? 5. And then sila pagdating do sa negotiating hall nila, they could probably send 20, 30 agad with backup teams behind you. And then let's say where would you set up your meetings? In the DFA, for example, sa Rojas Boulevard. When you go naman to China, they'll set up in a meeting hall na completely as large as, I don't know, the MOA or something.
The MOA Arena.
to be able to, in ganung sizes of their rooms there and stuff. So yung projection of power and all, and that's why they want it bilateral. Kasi yung ability nila to be coercive, ability nila to be intimidating is always there. And that's why it's a good strategy for us to go to multilateral route.
Para hindi tayo silaki ng basta-basta.
Yeah, exactly. And then yung sinabi ni Carlo na, and para malabas nga yung results ng negotiations, that's highly important in the transparency part of it. People might think that parang, what's with transparency? No, but it's incredibly important, especially if you're living in a democratic society. And in fact, I think what we need more is more transparency in terms of our negotiations and in terms of our dealings with other countries. I would really prefer that our Congress is more participative in these things. It would be great if there are more white papers that are released so that people could debate more going forward in relation to strategy. But so far, it has not been that way. But hopefully, with more young people there,
So, din tama ka. Kasi it doesn't have to be grand strategies all the time. It can be something as small And ito, I think this is one of the most successful strategies we adopted, was as simple as renaming it West Philippine Sea.
Exactly.
Kasi nung 90s pa lang, nasa school pa ako, ang tawag pa rin natin doon South China Sea. Pero within a generation, yung mga anak ko ngayon, hindi nila alam kung anong South China Sea. Ang alam nila ngayon, West Philippine Sea na.
Credit of course to former Congressman Walden Bello for coining that term na
Well,
talaga
actually, I was about to say, in a way, I'd like to get credit also for that because I was one of the first to keep on writing that in my column. And another one I think would be Henry Bensurto.
Henry Bensurto, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
so,
One of our unsung heroes.
Yes,
Yeah.
the simple fact of renaming it the West Philippine Sea is a huge deal. It's a huge thing.
Yeah. That's a good place to end. No? I want to hear final thoughts from everyone. Itong idea of naming and claiming, pero hindi lang itong idea that we're naming and claiming, but that it's more than that. It's an issue of principles. It's an issue of sovereignty. Maybe Carlo, you can start with your closing thoughts on
Sure.
this issue. I wish we had
Leloy,
more time, pero
yeah.
we have to
Definitely,
close
no?
the episode now.
Sa akin, Leloy, naisip ko agad, sa ating Pilipino, may dalawa tayong may salita, palaaway saka palaban. Itong issue na to, kailangan nating ma-distinguish yung hindi tayo naghahanap ng away. Pinaglalaban natin ang ating karapatan. There's a big difference to that. So yung mga nagsasabi na, ba't kayo naghahanap ng away? Hindi tayo naghahanap ng away. Pinaglalaban natin ang ating karapatan.
Sir, Dean Jeremy?
Actually, that's a very good point that Carlo just said. I don't know what else to add. So the only thing I'd like to add is we really just have to be, I don't know, I'm looking for the term. Yes, we're passionate, but at the same time, we have to grit our teeth and know na matagalang struggle to. I mean, this is something that we simply just have to outlast China in. This is not, para kasing the way we play basketball, sometimes kasi what happens is, pag nagkaroon ng emotion sa third quarter, fourth quarter, biglang-bigla, yung parang Hinebra, matatanggal yung... But international relations does not work this way. It's essentially a long, drawn-out chess battle with another country. And I really hope then that our countrymen and our youth will have to understand na pag when they see this little island there, I think it was Noynoy Aquino who said it. It's as if you're talking of Recto Avenue or Legarda or It's not simply a mere island or coral out there. It's essentially our home. And if something pa lang na like that, your own home cannot defend, I do not understand how we can look at ourselves in the mirror. And it's, I hope something that especially our young people could really understand. And that thing that is there is simply not merely a collection of sand or trees or what have you, but represents everything that we find good. That is why we stay here in this country, because we know that there is something good here. And the reason why we're defending that island is because of the fact that we are defending ultimately that good thing that we want to preserve, and we want to live on for our to succeed. So well, that's my thoughts for now.
Well
that's beautiful. Ako, I wanted to end on a reflection on the word patriotism. Ano ba talaga yung patriotic? Because patriotism is palaban nga, may emotional element siya. Pero meron din dapat siyang element of being well-informed. What are you directing your patriotism to? So patriotism is not well-informed, and it's not patriotism if it's racist, for example. Ang laban natin sa estado ng China, isa yung estado, isa yung political system na mapang-api. Hindi natin kalaban ang mga taong Chino. And especially hindi natin kalaban ang mga taong Chinoy na talagang mga Pilipino naman. Ang kalaban natin, yung gobyerno ni Xi Jinping na mapang-api, na isang diktadurya at isang gobyerno na gustong sakupin ang Pilipinas. Pangalawa, patriotism, I think, is well-informed in that it knows kung sino yung kalaban in any particular time. Ngayon, kung nabuhay ako noong 1898, at kasama ko si Emilio Aguinaldo at sinusugod ako ng mga Amerikano, ang kaaway ko mga Amerikano, malinaw yung aking patriotism. Pero ngayon in 2023, hindi po mga sundalo ni William McKinley at ni Teddy Roosevelt ang sumusugod sa atin dito sa Pilipinas, kundi ang mga vapor ni Xi Jinping. Kaya dapat napakalinaw na sila ang kalaban natin bilang mga patriot ngayong 2023. At yun yung patriotism na gano'n, I think that's kind of well-informed patriotism na bahagi talaga ng isang proyekto Pilipino. Natutunan ko yun dito sa conversation natin ngayon with Dean Jeremy, and of course, Carlo, thank you for bringing your experiences bilang isang former bilang isang miyembro ng ating DFA. Ulit po sa ngalan ni Manolo Quezon at ni Father Tito Caluwag, ako po si Leloy Claudio kasama si Claudio Santiago. This has been Proyekto Pilipino. Maraming salamat po.